Captains Courageous by Rudyard Kipling, Chapter 2.
"I warned you," said Dan, as the drops fell thick and fast on the dark oiled planking. "Dad ain't noways hasty, but you fair earned it. Pshaw! There's no sense takin' on so." Harvey's shoulders were rising and falling in spasms of dry sobbing. "I know the feeling. First time Dad laid me out was the last, and that was my first trip. Makes you feel sickish and lonesome. I know." "It does," moaned Harvey. "That man's either crazy or drunk, and I can't do anything." "Don't say that to Dad," whispered Dan. "He's set agin all liquor. And well, he told me you was the madman. What in creation made you call him a thief? He's my dad." Harvey sat up, mopped his nose, and told the story of the missing wad of bills. "I'm not crazy," he wound up. "Only your father has never seen more than a $5 bill at a time, and my father could buy up this boat once a week and never miss it." "You don't know what the We're Here's worth. Your dad must have a pile of money. How did he get it? Dad says loonies can't shake out a straight yarn. Go ahead." "In gold mines and things, West." "I've read that kind of business. Out West, too. Does he go round with a pistol on a trick pony, same as the circus? They call that the Wild West, and I've heard that their spurs and bridles was solid silver." "You are a chump," said Harvey, amused in spite of himself. "My father hasn't any use for ponies. When he wants to ride, he takes his car." "How? Lobster car?" "No, his own private car, of course. You've seen a private car some time in your life." "Slatin Beeman, he has one," said Dan cautiously. "I saw her at the Union Depot in Boston, with 3 niggers hoggin' her run." Dan meant cleaning the windows. "But Slatin Beeman he owns about every railroad on Long Island, they say, and they say he's bought about half New Hampshire and run a line fence round her, and filled her up with lions and tigers and bears and buffalo and crocodiles and such all. Slatin Beeman he's a millionaire. I've seen his car. Yes?" "Well, my father's what they call a multimillionaire, and he has 2 private cars. One's named for me, the Harvey, and one for my mother, the Constance." "Hold on," said Dan. "Dad don't ever let me swear, but I guess you can. 'Fore we go ahead, I want you to say hope you may die if you're lying." "Of course," said Harvey. "That ain't enough. Say, hope I may die if I ain't speaking truth." "Hope I may die right here," said Harvey, "if every word I've spoken isn't the cold truth." $134 in all?" said Dan. "I heard you talkin' to Dad, and I'd half looked you to be swallered up, same as Jonah." Harvey protested himself red in the face. Dan was a shrewd young person along his own lines, and 10 minutes' questioning convinced him that Harvey was not lying much. Besides, he had bound himself by the most terrible oath known to boyhood, and yet he sat alive, with a red-ended nose, in the scuppers, recounting marvels upon marvels. "Gosh!" said Dan at last, from the very bottom of his soul, when Harvey had completed an inventory of the car named in his honor. Then a grin of mischievous delight overspread his broad face. "I believe you, Harvey. Dad's made a mistake for once in his life." "He has, sure," said Harvey, who was meditating an early revenge. "He'll be mad clear through. Dad just hates to be mistook in his judgments." Dan lay back and slapped his thigh. "Oh, Harvey, don't you spile the catch by lettin' on." "I don't want to be knocked down again. I'll get even with him, though." "Never heard any man ever got even with Dad, but he'd knock you down again, sure. The more he was mistook, the more he'd do it. But gold mines and pistols! I never said a word about pistols.
Harvey cut in, for he was on his oath.
"That's so. No more you did. 2 private cars, then, one named for you and one for her, and $200 a month pocket money, all knocked into the scuppers for not working for 10.5 a month. It's the top haul of the season." He exploded with noiseless chuckles. "Then I was right?" said Harvey, who thought he had found a sympathizer. "You was wrong, the wrongest kind of wrong. You take right hold and pitch in alongside of me, or you'll catch it, and I'll catch it for backing you up. Dad always gives me double helps 'cause I'm his son, and he hates favouring folk. Guess you're kind of mad at Dad. I've been that way time and again, but Dad's a mighty just man. All the fleet says so." "Looks like justice, this, don't it?" Harvey pointed to his outraged nose. "That's nothin'. Lets the shore blood out of you. Dad did it for your health. Say, though, I can't have dealin's with a man that thinks me or Dad or any one on the We're Here's a thief. We ain't any common wharf-end crowd by any manner o' means. We're fishermen, and we've shipped together for 6 years and more. Don't you make any mistake on that. I told you Dad don't let me swear. He calls 'em vain oaths, and pounds me. But if I could say what you said about your pap and his fixin's, I'd say that 'bout your dollars. I dunno what was in your pockets when I dried your kit, for I didn't look to see. But I'd say, usin' the very same words as you used jest now, neither me nor Dad, and we was the only two that teched you after you were brought aboard, knows anything about the money. That's my say. Now?" The bloodletting had certainly cleared Harvey's brain, and perhaps the loneliness of the sea had something to do with it. "That's all right," he said. Then he looked down confusedly. "Seems to me that for a fellow just saved from drowning I haven't been over and above grateful, Dan." "Well, you was shook up and silly," said Dan. "Anyway, there was only Dad and me aboard to see it. The cook, he don't count." "I might have thought about losin' the bills that way," Harvey said, half to himself, "instead of callin' everybody in sight a thief. Where's your father?" "In the cabin. What do you want of him again?" "You'll see," said Harvey, and he stepped, rather groggily, for his head was still singing, to the cabin steps, where the little ship's clock hung in plain sight of the wheel. Troop, in the chocolate and yellow painted cabin, was busy with a notebook and an enormous black pencil, which he sucked hard from time to time. "I haven't acted quite right," said Harvey, surprised at his own meekness.
"What's wrong now?" said the skipper. "Walked into Dan, hev you?"
"No, it's about you."
"I'm here to listen."
"Well, I'm here to take things back," said Harvey, very quickly. "When a man's saved from drownin'..." He gulped.
"Eh? You'll make a man yet if you go on this way."
"He oughtn't begin by callin' people names."
"Jestin' right. Right in jest," said Troop, with the ghost of a dry smile.
"So I'm here to say I'm sorry." Another big gulp. Troop heaved himself slowly off the locker he was sitting on and held out an 11-inch hand.
"I mistrusted 'twould do you sights o' good. An' this shows I weren't mistook in my jedgments." A smothered chuckle on deck caught his ear. "I am very seldom mistook in my jedgments." The 11-inch hand closed on Harvey's, numbing it to the elbow. "We'll put a little more gristle to that 'fore we're done with you, young feller, an' I don't think any worse o' you for anything that's gone by. You wasn't fairly responsible. Go right about your business, an' you won't take no hurt."
"You're white," said Dan, as Harvey regained the deck, flushed to the tips of his ears. "I don't feel it," said he. "I didn't mean that way. I heard what Dad said. When Dad allows he don't think the worse of any man, Dad's give himself away. He hates to be mistook in his jedgments, too. Ho, ho! Once Dad has a jedgment, he'd sooner dip his colours to the British than change it." I'm glad it's settled right end up. Dad's right when he says he can't take you back. It's all the livin' we make here fishin'. The men'll be back like sharks after a dead whale in half an hour." "What for?" said Harvey. "Supper, of course. Don't your stomach tell you? You've a heap to learn." "Guess I have," said Harvey dolefully, looking at the tangle of ropes and blocks overhead. "She's a daisy," said Dan, enthusiastically, misunderstanding the look. "Wait till our mainsail's bent and she walks home with all her salt wet. There's some work first, though." He pointed down into the darkness of the open main hatch between the two masts. "What's that for? It's all empty," said Harvey. "You and me and a few more have got to fill it," said Dan. "That's where the fish goes." "Alive?" said Harvey. "Well, no. They're supposed to be rather dead, and flat, and salt. There's 100 hogshead of salt in the bins, and we hain't more'n covered our dunnage to now." "Where are the fish, though?" "In the sea, they say. In the boats we pray," said Dan, quoting a fisherman's proverb. "You come in last night with about 40 of 'em." He pointed to a sort of wooden pen just in front of the quarter deck. "You and me, we'll sluice that out when we're through. Send we'll hev full pens to night. I've seen her down half a foot with fish waitin' to clean, and we stood to the tables till we was splittin' ourselves instid of them, we was so sleepy. Yes, they're comin' in now." Dan looked over the low bulwarks at half a dozen dories, rowing towards them over the shining, silky sea. "I've never seen the sea from so low down," said Harvey. "It's fine." The low sun made the water all purple and pinkish, with golden lights on the barrels of the long swells, and blue and green mackerel shades in the hollows. Each schooner in sight seemed to be pulling her dories toward her by invisible strings, and the little black figures in the tiny boats pulled like clockwork toys. "They've struck on good," said Dan, between his half-shut eyes. "Manuel hain't room for another fish. Low as a lily pad in still water, ain't he?" "Which is Manuel? I don't see how you can tell 'em way off, as you do." "Last boat to the south'ard. He fund you last night," said Dan, pointing. "Manuel rows Portugoosey, and you can't mistake him. East of him he's a heap better'n he rows is Pennsylvania, loaded with saleratus by the looks of him. East o' him see how pretty they string out all along with the humpy shoulders is Long Jack. He's a Galway man inhabitin' South Boston, where they all live mostly, and mostly them Galway men are good in a boat. North, away yonder you'll hear him tune up in a minute is Tom Platt. Man o' war's man he was on the old Ohio. First of our navy, he says, to go round the Horn. He never talks of much else, 'cept when he sings, but he has fair fishin' luck. There, what did I tell you?" A melodious bellow stole across the water from the northern dory. Harvey heard something about somebody's hands and feet being cold, and then: "Bring forth the chart, the doleful chart. See where the mountains meet. The clouds are thick around their heads, the mists around their feet." "Full boat," said Dan, with a chuckle. "If he gives us 'O Captain,' it's toppin' full." The bellow continued: "And now to thee, O Capting, most earnestly I pray, that they shall never bury me in church or cloister gray." "Double game for Tom Platt. He'll tell you all about the old Ohio to morrow. See that blue dory behind him? He's my uncle, Dad's own brother, and if there's any bad luck loose on the Banks she'll fetch up agin Uncle Salters, sure. Look how tender he's rowin'. I'll lay my wage and share he's the only man stung up to day, and he's stung up good." "What'll sting him?" said Harvey, getting interested. "Strawberries mostly. Pumpkins sometimes, and sometimes lemons and cucumbers. Yes, he's stung up from his elbows down. That man's luck perfectly paralyzin'. Now we'll take a hold of the tackles and h'ist 'em in. Is it true what you told me just now, that you never done a hand's turn o' work in all your born life? Must feel kinder awful, don't it?" "I'm going to try to work anyway," Harvey replied stoutly. "Only it's all dead new." "Lay a hold of that tackle, then. Behind you." Harvey grabbed at a rope and long iron hook dangling from one of the stays of the mainmast, while Dan pulled down another that ran from something he called a topping lift, as Manuel drew alongside in his loaded dory. The Portuguese smiled a brilliant smile that Harvey learned to know well later, and a short-handled fork began to throw fish into the pen on deck. "231!" he shouted. "Give him the hook," said Dan, and Harvey ran it into Manuel's hands. He slipped it through a loop of rope at the dory's bow, caught Dan's tackle, hooked it to the stern becket, and clambered into the schooner. "Pull!" shouted Dan, and Harvey pulled, astonished to find how easily the dory rose. "Hold on she don't nest in the crosstrees!" Dan laughed, and Harvey held on, for the boat lay in the air above his head. "Lower away!" Dan shouted, and as Harvey lowered, Dan swayed the light boat with one hand till it landed softly just behind the mainmast. "They don't weigh nothin' empty. That was right smart for a passenger. There's more trick to it in a seaway." "Ha, ha!" said Manuel, holding out a brown hand. "You are some pretty well now? This time last night the fish they fish for you. Now you fish for fish. Eh, what?" I'm ever so grateful," Harvey stammered, and his unfortunate hand stole to his pocket once more, but he remembered that he had no money to offer. When he knew Manuel better, the mere thought of the mistake he might have made would cover him with hot, uneasy blushes in his bunk. "There is no to be thankful for to me," said Manuel. "How shall I leave you drift all around the banks? Now you are a fishman, eh, what?" "Ooh! Ah!" He bent backward and forward stiffly from the hips to get the kinks out of himself. "I have not clean boat to day. Too busy. They struck on queek. Danny, my son, clean for me." Harvey moved forward at once. Here was something he could do for the man who had saved his life. Dan threw him a swab, and he leaned over the dory, mopping up the slime clumsily, but with great good will. "Hike out the footboards. They slide in them grooves," said Dan. "Swab 'em and lay 'em down. Never let a footboard jam. You may want her bad some day. Here's Long Jack." A stream of glittering fish flew into the pen from a dory alongside. "Manuel, you take the tackle. I'll fix the tables. Harvey, clear Manuel's boat. Long Jack's nestin' on the top of her." Harvey looked up from his swabbing at the bottom of another dory just above his head. "Jest like the Injun puzzle boxes, ain't they?" said Dan as the one boat dropped into the other. "Takes to it like a duck to water," said Long Jack, a grizzly-chinned, long-lipped Galway man, bending to and fro exactly as Manuel had done. Disko in the cabin growled up the hatchway, and they could hear him suck his pencil. 149 and a half. Bad luck to ye, Discobolus," said Long Jack. "I'm murderin' myself to fill up your pockets. Slate it for a bad catch. The Portuguese has bait me." Whack came another dory alongside, and more fish shot into the pen. 203. Let's look at the passenger." The speaker was even larger than the Galway man, and his face was made curious by a purple cut running slantwise from his left eye to the right corner of his mouth. Not knowing what else to do, Harvey swabbed each dory as it came down, pulled out the footboards, and laid them in the bottom of the boat. "He's caught on good," said the scarred man, who was Tom Platt, watching him critically. "There are two ways of doing everything. One's fisher fashion, any end first and a slippery hitch over all, and the other's—" "What we did on the old Ohio," Dan interrupted, brushing into the knot of men with a log board on legs. "Get out of here, Tom Platt, and leave me fix the tables." He jammed one end of the board into two nicks in the bulwarks, kicked out the leg, and ducked just in time to avoid a swinging blow from the man-o'-war's man. "And they did that on the Ohio, too, Danny. See?" said Tom Platt, laughing. "Guess they were swivel-eyed then, for it didn't get home, and I know who'll find his boots on the main truck if he don't leave us alone. Haul ahead. I'm busy, can't you see?" "Danny, you lie on the cable and sleep all day," said Long Jack. "You're the height o' impidence, and I'm persuaded you'll corrupt our supercargo in a week." "His name's Harvey," said Dan, waving two strangely shaped knives, "and he'll be worth 5 of any South Boston clam digger 'fore long." He laid the knives tastefully on the table, cocked his head on one side, and admired the effect. "I think it's 42," said a small voice overside, and there was a roar of laughter as another voice answered, "Then my luck's turned fer once, 'cause I'm 45, though I be stung outer all shape." 42 or 45, I've lost count, the small voice said. "It's Penn and Uncle Salters countin' catch. This beats the circus any day," said Dan. "Jest look at them." Come in," roared Long Jack. "It's wet out yonder, children." 42, ye said. That was Uncle Salters. "I can't again, then," the voice replied meekly. The two dories swung together and bunted into the schooner's side. "Patience o' Jerusalem," snapped Uncle Salters, backing water with a splash. "What possessed a farmer like you to set foot in a boat beats me. You've nigh stove me all up." "I'm sorry, Mr. Salters. I came to sea on account of nervous dyspepsia. You advised me, I think." "You an' your nervous dyspepsy be drowned in the whale hole," roared Uncle Salters, a fat and tubby little man. "You're comin' down on me agin. Did you say 42 or 45?" "I've forgotten, Mr. Salters. Let's count." "Don't see as it could be 45. I'm 45," said Uncle Salters. "You count keerful, Penn." Disko Troop came out of the cabin. "Salters, you pitch your fish in now at once," he said in the tone of authority. "Don't spoil the catch, Dad," Dan murmured. "Them two are only just beginnin'." "Mother av delight! He's forkin' them one by one," howled Long Tom, as Uncle Salters got to work laboriously, the little man in the other dory counting a line of notches on the gunwale. "That was last week's catch," he said, looking up plaintively, his forefinger where he had left off. Manuel nudged Dan, who darted to the after tackle, and leaning far overside slipped the hook into the stern rope as Manuel made her fast forward. The others pulled gallantly and swung the boat in, man, fish, and all. 1, 2, 4, 9, said Tom Platt, counting with a practiced eye. 47. Penn, you're it. Dan let the after tackle run, and slid him out of the stern onto the deck amid a torrent of his own fish. "Hold on!" roared Uncle Salters, bobbing by the waist. "Hold on! I'm a bit mixed up on my count." He had no time to protest, but was hove inboard and treated like Pennsylvania. 41, said Tom Platt. "Beat by a farmer, Salters, and you sech a sailor, too." "'Tweren't fair count," said he, stumbling out of the pen, "and I'm all stung up to pieces." His thick hands were puffy and mottled purply white. "Some folks will find strawberry bottom," said Dan, addressing the newly risen moon, "if they have to dive fer it, seems to me." "An' others," said Uncle Salters, "eats the fat o' the land in sloth, and mocks their own blood kin." "Seat ye!" A voice Harvey had not heard called from the foc'sle. Disko Troop, Tom Platt, Long Jack, and Salters went forward on the word. Little Penn bent above his square deep-sea reel and the tangled codlines. Manuel lay down full length on the deck, and Dan dropped into the hold, where Harvey heard him banging casks with a hammer. "Salt," he said, returning. "Soon as we're through supper we get to dressing down. You'll pitch to Dad. Tom Platt and Dad they stow together, and you'll hear 'em arguin'. We're second half, you and me, and Manuel and Penn, the youth and beauty o' the boat." "What's the good o' that?" said Harvey. I'm hungry." "They'll be through in a minute. Sniff! She smells good to-night. Dad ship's a good cook if he do suffer with his brother. It's a full catch to-day, ain't it?" He pointed to the pens piled high with cod. "What water did ye hev, Manuel?" "25, father," said the Portuguese sleepily. "They strike on good an' queek. Some day I show you, Harvey." The moon was beginning to walk on the still sea before the elder men came aft. The cook had no need to cry second half. Dan and Manuel were down the hatch and at table ere Tom Platt, last and most deliberate of the elders, had finished wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Harvey followed Penn, and sat down before a tin pan of cod's tongues and sounds, mixed with scraps of pork and fried potato, a loaf of hot bread, and some black and powerful coffee. Hungry as they were, they waited while Pennsylvania solemnly asked a blessing. Then they stoked in silence, till Dan drew breath over his tin cup and demanded of Harvey how he felt. "Most full, but there's just room for another piece." The cook was a huge jet-black negro, and unlike all the negroes Harvey had met, did not talk, contenting himself with smiles and dumb-show invitations to eat more. "See, Harvey," said Dan, rapping with his fork on the table. "It's jest as I said. The young and handsome men, like me and Pensy, and you and Manuel, we're second half, and we eats when the first half are through. They're the old fish, and they're mean and humpy, and their stomachs has to be humored, so they come first, which they don't deserve. Ain't that so, doctor?" The cook nodded. "Can't he talk?" said Harvey in a whisper. "'Nough to get along. Not much o' anything we know. His natural tongue's kinder curious. Comes from the innards of Cape Breton, he does, where the farmers speak home-made Scotch. Cape Breton's full o' niggers whose folk run in there durin' our war, and they talk like the farmers, all huffy-chuffy." "That is not Scotch," said Pennsylvania. "That is Gaelic. So I read in a book." "Penn reads a heap. Most of what he says is so, 'cep when it comes to account o' fish, eh?" "Does your father just let them say how many they've caught without checking them?" said Harvey. "Why, yes. Where's the sense of a man lyin' for a few old cod?" "Was a man once lied for his catch," Manuel put in. "Lied every day. 5, 10, 25 more fish than come he say there was." "Where was that?" said Dan. "None of our folk." "Frenchman of Aguille." "Ah, those West Shore Frenchmen don't count anyways. Stands to reason they can't count. If you run acrost any of their soft hooks, Harvey, you'll know why," said Dan with an awful contempt. "Always more and never less, every time we come to dress." Long Jack roared down the hatch, and the second half scrambled up at once. The shadow of the masts and rigging, with the never-furled riding sail, rolled to and fro on the heaving deck in the moonlight, and the pile of fish by the stern shone like a dump of fluid silver. In the hold there were tramplings and rumblings where Disko Troop and Tom Platt moved among the salt bins. Dan passed Harvey a pitchfork, and led him to the inboard end of the rough table, where Uncle Salters was drumming impatiently with a knife haft. A tub of salt water lay at his feet. "You pitch to Dad and Tom Platt down the hatch, and take keer Uncle Salters don't cut your eye out," said Dan, swinging himself into the hold. "I'll pass salt below." Penn and Manuel stood knee-deep among cod in the pen, flourishing drawn knives. Long Jack, a basket at his feet and mittens on his hands, faced Uncle Salters at the table, and Harvey stared at the pitchfork and the tub. "Hi!" shouted Manuel, stooping to the fish, and bringing one up with a finger under its gill and a finger in its eye. He laid it on the edge of the pen, the knife blade glimmered with a sound of tearing, and the fish, slit from throat to vent, with a nick on either side of the neck, dropped at Long Jack's feet. "Hi!" said Long Jack, with a scoop of his mittened hand. The cod's liver dropped in the basket. Another wrench and scoop sent the head and offal flying, and the empty fish slid across to Uncle Salters, who snorted fiercely. There was another sound of tearing, the backbone flew over the bulwarks, and the fish, headless, gutted and open, splashed in the tub, sending the salt water into Harvey's astonished mouth. After the first yell, the men were silent. The cod moved along as though they were alive, and long ere Harvey had ceased wondering at the miraculous dexterity of it all, his tub was full. "Pitch," grunted Uncle Salters, without turning his head, and Harvey pitched the fish by twos and threes down the hatch. "Hi! Pitch 'em bunchy!" shouted Dan. "Don't scatter! Uncle Salters is the best splitter in the fleet. Watch him mind his book." Indeed, it looked a little as though the round uncle were cutting magazine pages against time. Manuel's body, cramped over it from the hips, stayed like a statue, but his long arms grabbed the fish without ceasing. Little Penn toiled valiantly, but it was easy to see he was weak. Once or twice Manuel found time to help him without breaking the chain of supplies, and once Manuel howled because he had caught his finger in a Frenchman's hook. These hooks are made of soft metal, to be rebent after use, but the cod very often get away with them and are hooked again elsewhere, and that is one of the many reasons why the Gloucester boats despise the Frenchmen. Down below, the rasping sound of rough salt rubbed on rough flesh sounded like the whirring of a grindstone, a steady undertune to the click-nick of the knives in the pen, the wrench and schloop of torn heads, dropped liver, and flying offal, the "Cra" of Uncle Salters's knife scooping away backbones, and the flap of wet, opened bodies falling into the tub. At the end of an hour Harvey would have given the world to rest, for fresh, wet cod weigh more than you would think, and his back ached with the steady pitching. But he felt for the first time in his life that he was one of a working gang of men, took pride in the thought, and held on sullenly. "Knife-o!" shouted Uncle Salters at last. Penn doubled up, gasping among the fish. Manuel bowed back and forth to supple himself, and Long Jack leaned over the bulwarks. The cook appeared, noiseless as a black shadow, collected a mass of backbones and heads, and retreated. "Blood ends for breakfast and head chowder," said Long Jack, smacking his lips. "Knife-ho!" repeated Uncle Salters, waving the flat, curved splitter's weapon. "Look by your foot, Harve!" cried Dan below. Harvey saw half a dozen knives stuck in a cleat in the hatch combing. He dealt these around, taking over the dulled ones. "Water," said Disko Troop. "Scuttlebutt's forward, and the dipper's alongside. Hurry, Harve," said Dan. He was back in a minute with a big dipper full of stale brown water, which tasted like nectar, and loosed the jaws of Disko and Tom Platt. "These are cod," said Disko. "They ain't Damascus figs, Tom Platt, nor yet silver bars. I've told you that every single time since we've sailed together." "A matter o' 7 seasons," returned Tom Platt coolly. "Good stowin's good stowin' all the same, and there's a right and a wrong way o' stowin' ballast even. If you'd ever seen 400 ton o' iron set into the Hi!" With a yell from Manuel, the work began again, and never stopped till the pen was empty. The instant the last fish was down, Disko Troop rolled aft to the cabin with his brother. Manuel and Long Jack went forward. Tom Platt only waited long enough to slide home the hatch ere he too disappeared. In half a minute Harvey heard deep snores in the cabin, and he was staring blankly at Dan and Penn. "I did a little better that time, Danny," said Penn, whose eyelids were heavy with sleep. "But I think it is my duty to help clean." "Wouldn't hev your conscience for 1,000 quintal," said Dan. "Turn in, Penn. You've no call to do boy's work. Draw a bucket, Harvey. Oh, Penn, dump these in the gurry butt 'fore you sleep. Can you keep awake that long?" Penn took up the heavy basket of fish livers, emptied them into a cask with a hinged top, lashed by the foc'sle. Then he too dropped out of sight in the cabin. "Boys clean up after dressin' down, an' first watch in calm weather is boys' watch on the We're Here. Dan sluiced the pen energetically, unshipped the table, set it up to dry in the moonlight, ran the red knife blades through a wad of oakum, and began to sharpen them on a tiny grindstone, as Harvey threw offal and backbones overboard under his direction. At the first splash a silvery white ghost rose bolt upright from the oily water and sighed a weir, whistling sigh. Harvey started back with a shout, but Dan only laughed. "Grampus," said he, "beggin' for fish heads. They upend that way when they're hungry. Breath on him like the doleful tombs, hain't he?" A horrible stench of decayed fish filled the air as the pillar of white sank, and the water bubbled oilily. "Hain't you never seen a grampus up end before? You'll see 'em by hundreds 'fore you're through. Say, it's good to have a boy aboard again. Otto was too old, an' a Dutchy at that. Him an' me we fought considerable. Wouldn't 'a' keered fer that if he'd had a Christian tongue in his head. Sleepy?" "Dead sleepy," said Harvey, nodding forward. "Mustn't sleep on watch. Rouse up an' see if our anchor light's bright an' shinin'. You're on watch now, Harve." "Pshaw! What's to hurt us? Bright as day." "Just when things happen, Dad says. Fine weather's good sleepin', an' 'fore you know, maybe, you're cut in two by a liner, an' 17 brass-bound officers, all gentlemen, lift their hand to it that your lights was out an' there was a thick fog. Harve, I've kinder took to you, but if you nod once more I'll lay into you with a rope's end." The moon, who sees many strange things on the Banks, looked down on a slim youth in knickerbockers and a red jersey staggering around the cluttered decks of a 70-ton schooner, while behind him, waving a knotted rope, walked, after the manner of an executioner, a boy who yawned and nodded between the blows he dealt. The lashed wheel groaned and kicked softly, the riding sail slatted a little in the shifts of the light wind, the windlass creaked, and the miserable procession continued. Harvey expostulated, threatened, whimpered, and at last wept outright, while Dan, the words clotting on his tongue, spoke of the beauty of watchfulness, and slashed away with the rope's end, punishing the dories as often as he hit Harvey. At last the clock in the cabin struck 10, and upon the 10th stroke little Penn crept on deck. He found 2 boys in 2 tumbled heaps side by side on the main hatch, so deeply asleep that he actually rolled them to their berths. End of chapter.